Hi, and welcome to Something to Talk About. I'm Linda McNamee, and for the next hour, I'm going to learn about childhood anxiety. I know it's a really tough and very difficult conversation, and it's not real cheerful, but I think it's really necessary, especially for parents with children, hence childhood anxiety. But before I begin, I would like to invite you that if you have a question for our wonderful guest, whom you will meet momentarily, you can always give us a call at 781-270-9199. Or if you have a suggestion for a future topic or a question for later on about anything, you can always email me at talk@bcattv.org. Love to get email. And as usual, I would like to thank the crew for this evening. We have Jolie Atwood and Stephanie Floridas, who are covering for this evening. Jolie gets to sit in the big director's chair tonight, so break a leg, Jolie, figuratively, not literally. And we also have Chris Flaherty and Corey McNeil, who are staff members here at BCAT, making sure the place runs smoothly and helps out us volunteers. Last but definitely not least, I want to thank my husband, Paul, for staying home for Daddy Date Night. Hang in there. It's almost bedtime. So now I would like to introduce my wonderful guest for this evening, Julie Cullen. I'm not going to list all the initials behind your name because that will just get me confused. But you are a licensed therapist that works with children.
Yes.
Yes. Do you work with families as well?
I do. I work with children, adolescents, families.
Because sometimes, it's not just the child, it's,
Usually
the bigger picture.
There's a bigger picture to work with.
Well, thank you very much for joining me this evening.
Thanks for having me.
It's like I love following you on Facebook, and it's like, oh, yeah. Well, that makes sense. So anyway, before we actually get into our conversation, can you tell me a little bit about yourself, like where you grew up, where you went to school, and how you came to the Burlington area, and why you decided to work with children and families in,
Yep.
anxiety and other, hopefully they're like happy things that you get to work with. So
Sure. Well, I grew up in North Andover, Massachusetts. So I've been
pretty local.
Yeah, I've been in Massachusetts pretty much my whole life. Graduated from North Andover High in '95, and all through high school, worked at day camps. I taught swim lessons. I was a lifeguard. I was a gymnast. I worked in the gym with the kids. I always knew that I would work with kids in some capacity.
Okay.
I didn't want to teach, so I didn't really know what
I
that
don't
was
want to
going to look
teach
like. But I knew kids would be involved somehow.
Okay.
So after high school, I went to University of Vermont,
okay.
I did my undergrad work there. I
went to UVM too.
Did he?
Yeah.
Great place.
My
dad took me there in January to make sure I knew what it was going to be like in the middle of winter. And
This is cold.
It was 60 degrees and sunny. It was great.
Don't think it was like that for your 4 years of
what
undergrad.
he planned. But I was there until '99. I majored in psychology, and I minored in political science, which was connected in the sense that I was interested in the way that policy played into how people kind of
Like
functioned
the whole public
in
health
life.
aspect?
Yes,
Okay.
a little different than sociology, which is more how people work together, more about how actually like the policy that we create affects how we live and how we function and how we feel.
Cool.
So then after I graduated, I had to figure out what I was doing with myself.
I'm still trying to figure that out.
I spent a year first in Needham, and then I went out to Arizona working in residential treatment facilities. And I was working with kids who had emotional and behavioral disabilities in these facilities where they lived, they went to school, they had all their therapies there, their family came in and did work, and I was sort of the floor staff. I helped them with their activities of daily living. I did crisis management, conflict resolution, problem solving. It was tough, but I really enjoyed it.
Like I would have been burned out by Tuesday.
It's not the kind of thing people stay in for a long time, but it is when you can connect with the kids and really kind of see the progress. It's so cool.
Oh yeah.
So I did that for a year, and I was like, I think I figured out I need to go back to school. I need to get my degree in social work, and I was sort of toying between social work and licensed mental health counselor, which is a shorter program. But again, that policy piece kind of came into play for me, and social work has a lot you do a lot of advocacy and sort of, again, understanding systems and policy and how it all plays together. So
how to
I
work within the system, because a lot of times that's like a big obstacle itself.
It's a huge part. And for kids, the biggest system that we deal with is school. So the other piece of when I came back, so I'd been living in Arizona, I came back to go to Boston University for my graduate work. And I enrolled in their dual degree program with and did a master's in social work as well as a master's in special ed. Again, knowing full well I would not teach, but wanting.
But it's good to have.
Wanting that kind of background in terms of how to read testing. You know, kids get tested, IEP testing in schools, and I get the reports, and I need to make sense out of that, what that means. And also, a lot of what I do is teaching in a sense. It's one-on-one, but it's helping kids learn skills and how to control what's going on, for how to control their thoughts, how to control the intensity of their emotions so it doesn't get them in trouble, and knowing how...
And understand those emotions and figure out, you know, why do I react this way?
And so knowing how kids learn is helpful in kind of finding a way to get to them.
And all kids learn differently. And
they do.
Yeah. And we'll go into later, you know, the whole standardized testing thing. And
yes.
We'll go into that.
Yes. And you know, the other piece of it too is that if you can't figure out, I can teach a skill, but if it doesn't get taught to a kid in a way that they understand or relate with, then it doesn't really mean anything to them. And so finding those little ways in, you know, between creating the relationship and also understanding learning styles.
Yeah, creating the relationship's got to be a huge issue as well, or because that child has to be able to trust you.
Yes.
And by the time they get, you know, I'm just making assumptions here, but by the time they reach the status where reach the stage where they need to go and talk to you, they've probably been let down, disappointed, failed, whatever that term is. So they probably already have pretty low self-esteem, and they're like, oh, here's another adult that's gonna, you know,
tell me how to fix it.
Yeah.
Absolutely. And you know, the way that I tend to work now, I tell parents I'm a long-term person. I'm not a 12-week, here's your set of skills, go home and use them. You know, the first month we're going to play games. We're going to talk to each other. We're going to learn about what we like and what we don't like. And it may not look like work, but it will lead to the ability to do the work. And without that first piece, you know, I don't really have anything. You got to figure out
what makes them tick before you...
And kids don't come to therapy because they want to come to therapy. Kids come to therapy because their parents tell them they have to come to therapy. Yeah. So giving them, helping them
knowing
understand...
what my kids are, you know,
helping
you have
them
to do this.
Understand that there's like a good reason here and that they're going to get something out of it.
I don't want to.
Right. Why do I have to do that? I get a lot of, I'm not talking to you. Sure you won't. Okay. But
let me tell you a story.
All the time. So, you know, I kind of started to see that that's what I needed to do. That's what I wanted to do. So I finished school in 2003 and started working again in residential because I kind of got bit. I got bit by the bug. And I spent 5 years at a program in Lexington as a clinician and 2 more years as the clinical
was this still
director.
like working with kids?
Yes,
and,
this
like,
was adolescent girls, 26 adolescent girls.
Fun!
In the same house, all of whom came in and said, by the way, just so you know, I hate girls. Okay. This will be fun.
That makes it so much easier. Thank you for sharing.
So,
yeah, I'm sorry.
At that point, I was the clinician. I was doing individual therapy, family therapy, group therapy, consulting with the teachers, working with parents, and helping kids hopefully transition.
Trying to connect all the dots and find the complete picture.
Trying to get them home, or at least to the next step.
Got it.
In the process of all of that, got married, we were expecting our first son, and so we started looking for a place to live, and that's how we ended up in Burlington. Oh. Literally the weekend before he was born. Oh. But that's okay. It was fine. Yeah. Speaking of anxiety. But so that was in
no pressure there.
2009, and so now we've been here ever since.
Excellent.
Yeah.
So I know this is like a loaded question, but, you know, sitting at home preparing these questions just to kind of give us, hence the name, something to talk about. Yeah. how would you define childhood anxiety?
So everybody has
It's
anxiety.
Like a catchphrase. Yeah. Some people just don't handle it as well
yeah.
as others.
and it's sort of like, I use the movie Inside Out all the time because I don't know how I wasn't part of that team. But
sequel.
We need anxiety. Anxiety keeps us alive. It's fear. It keeps us from jumping out in front of the car or off the cliff, walking off the cliff or off a bridge. So we need anxiety. But anxiety becomes a problem when it gets to the point where we can't function.
Yeah.
It keeps us from leaving the house, getting out of bed, going to school. And the childhood piece is just where it's beginning in childhood, and we're seeing it a lot more in younger and younger kids.
Because I was going to ask, how has that trend changed since we were in elementary school? And
obviously I wasn't doing this in elementary school, but I can say that in the last 10 or 15 years, I've seen such an increase in the number of kids coming in with anxiety and a decrease in the age at which it's starting for kids.
Wow.
So I've had kids come in as young as 5 and 6 years old.
Wow.
Can't go to the park. Yeah, can't play in the park. Can't go to play groups with other kids. Don't want to go to school. Preschool. The preschool separations that are just
that's gotta
over the
rip
top.
Your heart out.
It does. Yeah. It does. And obviously these are kids who can't articulate what's going on for them, which makes it that much harder because they're 4, 5, 6.
Yeah, and they just don't have the vocabulary.
Right.
And also the experience to rely on as well, because a lot of it is experience.
Right. And, so I think when I think of how would I define it, I think I would just define it as anxiety that's gotten out of control.
Okay.
And caused an inability to function, and that's when it becomes a problem. And it's actually one of the things that once I've worked with somebody for a long time, some of my older clients, I often have the conversation of okay, when you came in here, your anxiety was out of control, so we did a lot of things to try and rein it in, but just because you feel anxious doesn't mean you're back to square one, because then they start to relate the anxiety with being, with being overly anxious and not being able to function, and then feeling like I'm going backwards and it's going to get out of control, and then it does because the thoughts
and then
create
that brings up so much more anxiety.
So we talk a lot about how being anxious doesn't mean we have a problem here.
Okay.
It just means we have to manage it. We have to use some strategies. We have to calm it down, and we have to make sure that we can function.
And in the movie Inside Out, we need to give Joy a Valium. No.
Yes.
Sorry. That popped into my head. So, okay, we have this generic term of anxiety and the inhibiting of certain normal behaviors and normal function. But are there different types of anxiety, like either labels or behaviors?
Sure. So when we have a diagnostic manual that we have to use.
Yes, and when I was a psychology major, it was the DSM-3R, and now you said it's up to 5?
We are now into 5, and it has lots of pros and cons.
I'm not dating myself at all.
There are lots of pros and cons to it, and that's another day.
That's a whole other. So anyway,
but right now, what we've got is a couple different categories. We've got specific phobias. So kids who are absolutely terrified of spiders, or there's.
I was going to ask if these phobias are, agoraphobia, fear of the outdoors, versus fear of a spider.
Well, the specific phobias are a thing, the very specific thing that they're afraid of. Then you have your separation anxiety, which you see as a normal behavior in younger toddlers and preschool kids, but again can kind of go out of control. So it's that normal separation anxiety of I'm going to preschool for the first time and I don't want my mom to go, so I'm going to cry. And maybe she'll stay, but then when she leaves and I'm with everybody else, I'm fine.
Yeah.
So separation anxiety disorder would be mom leaves and 45 minutes later we're calling because kid is still
But that
tantruming.
Also could be circumstantial as well. I mean, there is that normal, I've always been with mom and now mom wants me to be in this strange place. But then there's also I don't know if this is changing or not, but single parents, you know, if they already lost one parent for whatever
Sure.
reason, and now they're being raised by a single parent, and that single parent drops them off at
Right.
preschool, it's like, are you coming back?
Right.
Because the other parent never came back.
Right.
So, I mean,
So there's that fear,
how
but
does-
it's again, it's that fear of separation,
Okay.
that you're going to leave and not come back, and I can't be
Okay.
away from you because I'm not safe if I'm not with you.
okay.
So again, we see it present as sort of a normal behavior, and then there's the extreme where it becomes to the point that you can't function.
Where the kid screams for 3 hours
Can't
until
go
mom
to
comes
daycare,
back.
mom can't work, dad can't, somebody's got to
or
be
gets
home. And
kicked out of daycare.
that sort of thing.
That sort of thing. Got it. Okay.
In terms of, you had mentioned agoraphobia. So agoraphobia is that fear of going anyway, that fear of leaving, being away from home, being away from your safe zone. And that actually is often seen with social phobia, which is a fear of being around other people and interacting with other people.
They can be independent, though.
They can be independent, yes.
Okay.
They often go
Because I'm
hand
like,
in
I
hand.
hate big groups, you know, but I'm okay with going to the playground.
Right. And they can go. You usually see somebody who's agoraphobic usually has some social anxiety as well, but those who have some social anxiety don't necessarily have agoraphobia.
Now, does this also, I'm sure we'll get to this later, but like obsessive compulsive disorder, where, you know, they have to lock the door 3 times before they, you know, but that doesn't always.
That is considered a separate disorder, and
Okay.
actually is not now considered an anxiety disorder.
Oh, it is or is not?
It is not.
Oh, okay.
Although I still, in thinking about it, I've always thought of it that way. So
Okay.
it's hard to kind of shift gears. So it's still in my
Understood.
world as an anxiety disorder.
Okay.
And
And it might be in, you know, the next version of the
exactly.
DSM.
Who knows? But the social anxiety comes up a lot in high school kids because it's a fear of how you're presenting to other people.
Okay, like the peer pressure starts kicking
If
in.
it is, and it's like, am I going to say something wrong? What are they going to think if I say this? Do I look okay? I can't possibly go around other people because they're gonna judge me.
I have a zit.
Exactly. And so we see it a lot, and that kind of often is what leads to school phobias and refusal to go to school and that kind of stuff. Because I can't possibly go to school because everyone's going to judge me when I go there.
And that's actually starting younger and younger.
Yes, it is.
Like I've heard like kindergartners and first graders, like, oh, you can't sit with me at the cafeteria.
Yes.
You got to go sit somewhere else. I don't want to be seen with you.
Yeah.
Like, you're fine.
So I keep saying, but you're so young. How is it starting now?
Who told you this? Who taught you this?
And that gets into sort of what kids are learning and where they're learning it from, and
where are they learning it from? Is it like television and media, or
sometimes I think kids with older siblings sometimes can pick up on behaviors, and we see it come out. So they're younger kids playing out older behaviors.
Oh, that never happened.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's pretty common. We see that a lot with general
This is
behaviors,
sarcasm.
but
in
yeah.
that
And so then there's this other category of generalized anxiety disorder, which kind of means you can be worried about anything at any time for any reason.
and that narrows it down.
These are kids that literally worry about everything. These are the overthinkers, the kids who are laying in bed at night. They can't sleep because they're just thinking about what if. And one thought leads to the next thought, leads to the next thought.
So it could be like irrational.
Completely irrational.
And what if it starts to rain, and what happens if we lose electricity?
And they can know it's irrational, but can't
It doesn't
stop
help.
it.
Yeah, because your brain is still going to
Yes.
think it.
Yes.
You can't, I'm sure everybody, anxiety or not, has
Right.
like
Had
lied
those
awake
nights.
at night going, okay, brain, you can shut down
Yes.
now.
And it's the thing where like you go to the point where you're thinking at the same time, I know I'm blowing this way out of proportion, but I can't stop feeling bad about it. I can't stop feeling anxious about it. I don't know how to make this stop. And for some of these kids, it's just constant. And they just can't turn that voice off in their head.
Wow.
And the things that they're worried about, I see this a lot in sort of late elementary, middle school kind of kids who, are still kind of trying to figure out how to answer these questions and how to understand the world. And so much is being thrown at them, and they're sort of like, overwhelmed and overstimulated with all the information that they're getting.
Okay.
And so they are learning how to ask these questions, but they're not necessarily learning how to answer these questions. So they spiral out of control.
Oh, okay.
And so these kids can get paralyzed by that because they just, what if I walk out of my house and I get run over by a car? What if I go to school, and so it sort of incorporates some of these other disorders, the other thought processes.
So it takes the other anxiety
and
kind of
puts
brings
it all
in with the general
together and rolls it into a big ball of like panic.
And it snowballs and it just gets bigger and bigger and bigger and bigger.
Yes.
And, as you were talking, I'm thinking, just the information overload. We have such easy access to so much information.
Way too much.
And, just one example, if you ever get sick, do not go on WebMD.
No, do not. And block
because,
it, in fact.
You might have a hangnail. Oh, you're going to die.
Yep,
So,
absolutely. And health issues are a big, for kids with generalized anxiety, health issues are a big one. Everything, is the worst.
And plus, I think, nowadays, I was just talking to somebody recently, back when we were growing up, our parents tried to shelter us from everything going on. And now it's like everything's out in the open. And there's a lot more communication.
If you want to shelter, it's very hard to shelter.
Yeah.
Because you may not say something, but then they're going to hear it from somewhere else.
Right.
And that's one of the hardest things is sort of how do you, when you have a kid that particularly, watches the news and gets very anxious, how do you protect them from that? Because if they don't watch the news, they're going to go to school the next day. And the kids are going to be talking, or the teacher's going to talk, or somebody's going to say something. And then they're going to come home and they're going to be like, oh my God, this terrible thing is happening. And so if you're watching it with them, you have the opportunity to have the conversation with them first, but then you've got to tolerate and know that anxiety is coming. And so how do you have that conversation as the parent, knowing that it's going to create that anxiety? And I want to protect them from that, so I don't want to have that conversation, but then am I really protecting them?
Right.
Because then they're going to have that anxiety at school or at their friend's house or wherever.
I'm just thinking, in my own personal life, I volunteer at my son's school. He's in kindergarten. And I know it's a reality that we all need to face. But as far as my decision to talk about my child versus my wanting to shelter him, I was volunteering in the school and they had a lockdown drill. It was just a drill.
Yeah.
But seeing all these 5-year-olds turn the lights out, pull the shades down, go in the corner, and be quiet for 10 minutes. How do you keep a 5-year-old quiet and still for 10 minutes? And, my son, God love him, he was holding this little girl's hand, and she was really anxious about it. And it's like, I don't want to watch the news with my 5-year-old.
Right.
And say, oh, well, there are bad people in this world that might show up at your school and try to hurt you. How can that not lead to anxiety in a 5-year-old?
Right. Well, and it does. And so the question becomes, how do we have a conversation with a 5-year-old about what this is all about?
How do we have a conversation? While we're at it.
I guess that's what I meant.
You thought the reason why I wanted you here was, free therapy. No.
Well, so I think one of the things that we need to do for our kids is give them real information, but at an age-appropriate level. So with a 5-year-old, we're not going to say, we're doing this lockdown drill in case a man with a gun shows up at your school. But you might say to them, well, sometimes bad things happen, and we need to be prepared. So we don't know that something's going to happen. We don't know that we just want to be prepared in case something were to happen. That we know that we can say to you guys, we're going to go into this mode, and everybody goes and knows what to do. And everybody has the same language and the same information. So you're using language or an explanation for the kids that, gives them the basics, gives them the facts, because that's the basic fact. Something bad might happen, and we want to be able to say code whatever, and everybody goes to the right spot.
But it still broke my heart, though.
Yeah, I mean, it does. And getting we got a letter home the other day saying they had done the same thing at my son's school. And, so I said, did you have a lockdown drill today? I don't know. Did you have to, sit quietly for
in the dark?
Minutes? In the dark? Oh, yeah, that. Yeah, we did that. So in some respects, I think that they are giving them that sort of minimal information that this is what you have to do.
Okay.
without trying to hype it up too much, which I think is okay.
Right.
You know?
And I understand that it's a reality of
Yes.
today. And had I been home
Yeah,
and got that, got the letter in the
Yeah.
mail going, oh, yeah, okay. But just seeing the looks on
Being
their
there
faces
must have been
and being there
intense.
I had to fight back tears.
Yeah,
It was
I'm
so
sure.
intense. And I'm sure if I was sitting at my kitchen table going, I would not have gotten, that emotional.
Well, I think being there, you also kind of have that memory of what elementary school was like for us, which was we weren't doing lockdown drills.
Right.
And, we had fire drills and we had other things.
And I think even when there was a fire drill, it's like, oh, okay, let's just
yeah,
go
we
outside
just
for a
went
walk.
outside for a little bit, and it was no big deal. And it was never a fire. It was always just a drill, and it was just more annoying. Sometimes you couldn't get your coat first, and it was cold outside. But, I think it does bring back those memories of just the fact that, like, we didn't have to worry about these things.
Right.
And it is sad that our kids have to worry about these things. And of course, having to worry about these heavy duty, intense things is going to create a level of anxiety that we just didn't have. It creates that baseline that they're sort of starting with all this stuff. And then you add sort of the everyday little things and it builds up over time.
Okay, so let's get off lockdown mode.
Yes.
But back, that's why I have the questions here. Regroup. Now, with all of, we'll get to ages later, but do you see like a gender differentiation in like girls tend to be more anxious than boys or, because girls are still allowed to show their emotions and boys have to just, man up. And
what I find is girls get called anxious and boys get called oppositional. So girls come into my office because they're so anxious and they're crying about everything and they can't do things. And boys come to my office because they're angry and aggressive and mean.
Okay.
But when you start to have conversations about what's actually going on, these are both reactions to feeling anxious, to being worried about things. Often with boys, what I see is they start to feel bad, they start to feel guilty, they start to feel, like they've done something wrong, and they feel sort of backed into a corner, and they don't know how to get out of the corner.
Okay.
And so
they lash out.
They're worried about disappointing people, letting people down, not living up to the expectation, and so they lash out aggressively. Okay. Whereas girls will cry in that same situation. Okay. So while yes, we tend to say that females are more often diagnosed with anxiety disorders than males, I think there's probably, all of that is subjective in some ways. And I think that
so like a misdiagnosis?
It may, diagnosing these disorders it's hard because, I remember going into my first psychology class and the professor saying, listen, you're going to look at these and you're going to think that you have all of them. But you have none of them unless you have
I think my
actually
psychology
been
teacher had the
diagnosed
same
by somebody. So it's hard because you can probably fit into a bunch of categories. You could open the DSM and you could probably fit into a whole bunch of disorders.
Yep, that's me. Or even the general going for the doctor for your physical. Do you ever feel anxious? Do you?
Yes. Yeah. I mean, because how do you answer those? No, it's not real.
Right.
We all feel all of these things. We all have all of these.
There's a scale too. Do you ever feel anxious? Well, yeah.
And that's what's missing in some of this is that scale of like, well, how bad is it?
On
and
a
most,
scale of 1 to 10,
a lot of the definitions do say like that creates an inability to function kind of thing. But so I don't know if it's misdiagnosis. It's a little subjective. It's a little hard to tease out sometimes. I think we tend to look a lot at the behavior we're presented with because it's so obvious, as opposed to the things that kids are thinking and feeling. And I think it's really hard to get from kids what they're thinking and feeling. So sometimes it just takes a while to get there, and so it might be called something else until you can really tease out that what's behind all of this is fear of not meeting expectations.
Now, do you think sometimes, again, tangent, if a child doesn't feel like he or she is meeting the expectations, is that kind of when you pull the family in to see if the parents are putting unrealistic expectations?
Yeah.
Or, my daughter sometimes comes up with these things. I'm like, where did you get that from?
Absolutely.
I've never told you needed to be perfect.
Yep, absolutely.
Why do you think you need to be perfect? So,
well, Because the other thing with anxiety is once we're anxious, it colors how we see things. So our perception of what's going on is not always the intent of the other people in our world.
Okay.
So absolutely, I see lots of kids, particularly some of the older adolescent kids who come in and, they have to have all A pluses and they have to be perfect, great athletes, and they have to excel at everything. Well, why? Well, because if I don't, my parents will be mad at me. Really?
Your parents tell you that.
And then you have a conversation with the parent who says, well, no, we want her to try. As long as she's trying her hardest, or as long as he's, going to practice and meeting his commitment. So where is it?
Once in a while you do get the parent. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. We work on that. That's a little easier but it's some of this can be hard to tease out because, also I see these kids and families an hour a week, sometimes every other week. So what's happening in my office and what's happening out in the world could be
also just
very
a snapshot,
different
because we all have good days, we all have bad days. So they might see you on a good day.
Exactly. And so where are kids getting these messages and why do they perceive things are happening the way that they happen? So that is sometimes when I'll bring everybody in, or sometimes I'll talk to the parents alone. Sometimes we'll do it all together depending on the situation. I tend to be very flexible and fluid with how and who is in the room, depending on the situation. And but we'll talk about, where could these messages be coming from? It's not your intent, but what could be happening that could be causing his or her perception to be that you expect this from them.
Right.
Sometimes it's little things that we do that we don't even realize we're doing. And because the kids are already anxious about excelling, because then you can get into standardized testing and Common Core standards and all of these expectations at school, that there's a lot of pressure there. So they already come into the conversation with that pressure in their head. Then you say, oh, you only got an 85 on that test? And they hear that as...
Only?
Right.
Yeah.
They hear that as, you're not perfect.
Yeah.
That's not the intent. Maybe you just said it like that because usually they get 90s on math tests. But it's because when you're already anxious, you're looking at every conversation you have after that through that lens of anxiety.
And I'm also thinking, as you're talking, I'm also thinking like what we as parents say. Like, I know I've been cautioned a lot on, trying to teach my daughter positive self-image, not wanting her, not setting unrealistic expectations of her weight or how she looks or how she dresses. And, no, I don't want my daughter to be a princess. I want her to be, I don't want to say like everybody else, but I want her to be her own person.
Right.
You can take care of yourself.
Right.
You do not need someone else to come and rescue you.
Right.
But, just society in general.
They're getting messages from us, but yes, then they're also getting messages from society. And those mixed messages can be incredibly difficult to kind of sift through.
Yeah.
And it comes from conversation and talking to our kids and having these conversations early on, and setting the message from home. So that when they go out into the world and they're hearing all this other stuff, they feel like there's a place they can come back to say, okay, so you've always said X, but now I'm hearing this other thing and they don't match together. So how do I do this? But
what is
really,
the story, really?
Opening those lines of communication.
Okay.
And I think when we're talking about anxiety, particularly with kids as they're getting into middle school and high school, that communication piece becomes really key. Because they are getting to a point where they can start to articulate some things. Now, when you're anxious, articulating anything is hard, regardless of how old you are.
Well, because your brain's just spinning in a million directions.
Sometimes you're trying to explain it, and you're getting that look of like, this doesn't make any sense, which is not helping.
Yeah.
Because you know. And, I've had kids say, I know it doesn't make any sense. So why would I say it out loud? And why would I talk about it? Because I know it doesn't make any sense. Well, because if you don't talk about it, then we don't know that it's happening. And if we don't know that it's happening, we can't help you come up with strategies to combat it. But if you start that conversation early on, then your kids know that there's a safe place to come back to talk about those scary feelings.
Yeah, like I've seen, I spend way too much time on Facebook, but, they're like, when your child comes up and wants to ask you about the little things, take the time and talk
Yeah.
to them, because for them, those little things are huge.
Right.
So when it is important to you, you want them to feel safe enough to come
Right.
and
And I
talk
also
to you.
think, sometimes kids' experience of emotion is sort of happy, sad, angry, nervous, or worried. And we often leave it at that. But if we leave it at that, they leave it at that. And emotions become so much more complex as kids get older. So asking them questions about, well, what does that mean? When you say you feel worried about something, what does that mean? What does that mean for you? Do you feel, how do you know you're worried? Is it because of what you're thinking about? Does your body feel a certain way? What are the things that make you say to me, Mommy, I feel worried?
Okay.
And starting to have those conversations with them so they can start to tease out the difference between some of these different emotions. And they can start to pick up the red flags so they can, it's always easier to be proactive about addressing an emotion than it is to try and dial it down in the moment once it's already gone off the rails.
Okay.
So if I can notice that my heart's racing a little and my stomach feels like butterflies, and that means I'm getting anxious, so I should probably go distract myself with something else. That's a lot easier to do than I'm having a panic attack.
Raise their awareness of
that it's coming.
Yeah.
Because that's a whole lot easier than trying to
talk yourself down off a
de-escalate
ledge.
the panic attack.
Exactly.
De-escalating panic attack is hard. and you can use every strategy in the book, but that is really more about waiting and getting through it. Whereas if you can catch those red flags because you've had those conversations and they start to notice them, you can be proactive and not get there.
Got it. Now, how does anxiety play like a role with depression as well? Because sometimes anxiety is like the heart racing and depressing.
Yeah.
Sometimes it does, but then sometimes it seems like it's almost like an opposite thing, maybe.
I think,
like a manic thing or bipolar thing. Or
what I see happen is, kids, I saw something one time that talked about how, anxiety is worrying about everything and caring about everything. And depression is like caring about nothing. And so when you're anxious and depressed at the same time, it's like your mind is blown because you care about everything and nothing all at once. And how do you even do that? But you do. And I think that that's a pretty accurate description of the experience from what I hear from these kids, that, my take is the anxiety kind of breeds the depression because you're so anxious and you feel so on edge all the time that you start to feel depressed because why do I feel like this all the time? How come I can't fix this? What is wrong with me that I can't be like everybody else and just have fun and enjoy myself because I'm worried all the time? And so that kind of breeds that, like, I don't want to go out, I don't want to do anything, I don't want to.
But they can exist separately.
They can exist separately. Okay. Absolutely. They do. They often come together, but they absolutely can exist separately, and one doesn't have to mean the other is coming.
Okay. Now, we talked a little bit earlier about gender roles, but does either race or socioeconomic status or, I don't know, even religion, I mean, are there other social factors that predispose kids to?
I think that there is definitely a cultural piece to this in terms of how we define a disorder and what constitutes a disorder. So there definitely are some groups where if you suck it up, you're anxious, move on. Like, we're all anxious. You just need to so
snap out of it.
Yeah, so kids kind of get this idea that, like, okay, this isn't a big deal. I just need to kind of so they don't identify it as a disorder. Doesn't mean that it's not, and doesn't mean that it doesn't affect how they function. So I think there definitely are numbers that sort of identify in the research, like if we pull records of diagnoses, we can kind of separate out different ethnicities and whatnot. But I think, again, ultimately what it kind of comes down to is we all have these emotions, and how the people around us react to them can really impact whether they get better or worse. and whether we feel like we believe we can handle them or not.
Okay.
And I think my sense right now is that the places where kids spend a lot of their time between home and school and sports play a huge role in creating that net for them that says you can handle this.
Okay. Which actually brings me, children's not to like read verbatim, but children's lives today just seem so much more structured. Like, I am my daughter's Girl Scout leader, and it's so hard to try finding how Girl Scouts fit in, because there's some kids that take soccer and basketball and lacrosse and dance and, math club and music lessons, and my head explodes just trying to think about it.
When kids first come into my office, I ask them about their schedules because we have to find a time. And it's there are days that I'm like, all right, well, I'm going to have to call you when I have an opening during one of those spots, because there's 2 in your entire week that could possibly work. Kids' schedules are incredibly structured, and it comes from this idea that they have to be good at everything, and they have to be well-rounded, and they should have sports activities, and they should have community activities, and they should have music, and they should have art, and all of those things are great. But when you put so much on their plate that they're going from one thing to the next, they can't enjoy where they are because they're worried about where they're going next and who's going to pick them up and how they're going to get there and what they're going to do. And they're not actually enjoying the thing that they're doing.
And there's also practice, because not only do you have these structured activities, if you take a music lesson, well, you have to practice 30 minutes a day. And you go to sports, well, you have to,
and
practice,
again, all of these
throwing a
things
baseball.
are great. And they are enraching, and we do want to expose our kids to a variety of different things.
Sometimes kids just need to be kids, and
you have to
go
make
outside and play
choices.
in the mud.
And this is another part of it, which is, teaching kids how to make choices and decisions. And sometimes they're hard, and sometimes it means, do you want to take music lessons or play tennis? And you have to make that decision, and you want to do both, but you can only do one right now. So how does that work? What does that look like? Do we do one now and one next session, or one this year and one next year? And we have to make those hard decisions with our kids. And there's sort of, it's interesting because I see both sides of it. I see the kids who want to do everything, and then I see the kids who want to do nothing. And
wanting to do nothing and needing to do nothing sometimes
are 2 different things. So it's finding that balance between keeping our kids engaged with other kids, engaged in relationship, engaged in activities that make them feel good about themselves, but also giving them that downtime to be able to figure out what it is they do like and what they are interested in, and how to naturally navigate through peer relationships, how to solve problems on their own. Another piece of the anxiety puzzle for kids is I think that we do so much for them that they become anxious that they can't do it on their own. So if we're always there when they have friends over, or if they're always in structured activities with adults and they never have that natural free time to play with other kids and naturally figure out how to solve problems together, when they are in that situation, they freeze and don't know what to do. So they don't want to be in that situation. They don't want to play with their friends without a structured activity.
But I think society also kind of dictates that, because like when I was growing up, my parents said, get out of the house, go do something. And now it's like my kid comes up to me and says, so can you set up a play date for me?
Yes.
And you have to go to the play date, and at least I've just been going through this with my daughter. I want to see where they're going, at least the first play date.
Sure.
So it's like, and then if you have a sibling, then it's like, how do you make this kid happy, but this kid might get upset, and then you're trying to...
There's a lot less opportunity for that natural play. Parents are working more. Parents are working till 5 or 6 o'clock at night, and so kids are at after-school programs, and kids are, at daycare programs and things like that, which are great, and it's great that they exist because we need them so parents can work. But at the same time, it means the kid who is home can't just go outside and play because there's no one there. There's no one there to play with. And so again,
so they play video games,
sort of missing out, and then
learn the lack of social skills.
And then the screen time becomes another piece of it because there's so much stimulation getting into their little brains from all the video games and computer games and iPad games, and
And even school now requires certain iPad time and screen time, and it's like, then the kid wants to play the video games or wants the TV.
And when you say you should go play with your toys, they look at you like you're crazy.
Well,
What,
I
toys?
want to play with my iPad. My iPad's my toy. It's like,
right, exactly.
Time for you to do something.
Yes.
There's nothing to do.
It definitely impacts what's going on for our kids, because again, part of their anxiety is that they don't have the ability or the trust in themselves to be able to solve these problems. And so they don't want to be in a situation where the problems might arise because they don't believe that they can solve them. And that fear of having to solve those problems can create anxiety.
So how do we fix this? Can we fix it? No pressure.
Well, the magic answer is, it's complicated, obviously. I mean, the other piece, because the other piece of this puzzle is school and the developmental expectations.
Again, with, the developmental expectations, when I was in kindergarten, we had to learn our colors, and we were lucky if we learned our alphabet by the end of kindergarten. Now kids are writing complete sentences and keeping journals and, doing algebra in first grade. I'm like, I think I was in 7th grade before I learned algebra.
Right, and
no pressure.
Ultimately being asked to sit still, which doesn't really work well for 5 and 6 and 7-year-old kids.
Because you have to learn this. Sit still and learn this.
And it's interesting because we have these policies in place that require all of these standards to be met. And so in order for the standards to be met, teachers need to keep the kids working and doing. So we've cut back on lunch times and we've cut back on recess times. Yet at the same time, there's all this research coming out of the educational world that says K through 2, these kids need 4 recess times a day.
Yeah.
Can you imagine in our schools
homework.
having 4 recess times? I mean, it seems absurd, but yet the research is showing us that more recess, more time to play, more time to move their bodies allows their brain to process information better. Allows their body to be able to stay still to hear what you're saying to them better. So we've tried to incorporate in our country brain breaks and activity within the classroom, which is a great strategy to use based on what we have and what we have to get accomplished. And these teachers have a lot of expectation on them as well. To have
understood.
These kids,
I
meet these standards that I look at it and go, wow, that's really hard.
And with half the class being on some level of IEP, trying to get everybody learning the same information.
And then you think about
addressing individual needs. It's just,
and you think about kindergarten, where they're all coming in on a different playing field. Some kids have had preschool every single day for the last year. Other kids have never gone to school outside of their own home. And so you're trying to get everybody.
Extended daycare, it's like, there's some structure in there as well. Versus
you're trying to get everybody on the same page, and it's hard, and again, it's that balance of, I want my kid to meet the expectations, even though sometimes I feel like the expectations are not necessarily fair to my kid. So how do I help them understand what they need to do without, and then trying not to give the bias and keep that out of it when you're having a conversation
keep your
with
own
a kid.
anxiety level down.
It's very complicated. But, ultimately these kids are being asked to sit and do work a whole lot longer than they've ever been asked in their entire lives. And in just the evolution of our educational system, kids are being asked to sit more than they have. And that plays a role in fidgetiness. It plays a role in ability to process information. We know all of this.
Do you also, speaking of processing information and having those expectations, it seems from, the layperson's perspective that more kids are being diagnosed with ADHD. Do you think that it's just our awareness and putting a label on it, or do you think society and behaviors and expectations have just caused more kids' brains to want to explode?
I think it's a little of both. I think we certainly label more than we ever have. But I also think that, sometimes we're labeling things that maybe we don't need to be, that you give it a couple of years, or you try a couple of different strategies.
Okay.
Maybe things even out a little bit. I think it's become a very easy way to explain why kids have a hard time sitting without really looking or thinking more deeply about it. I believe ADHD absolutely exists, and there are kids that really struggle and have such a hard time.
No, I understand that, but
and
I'm
yeah,
just like,
and I believe that 100%. But I also believe there are kids who are diagnosed that maybe don't need to be.
right.
And so it's all these nice fine lines that are hard to kind of pinpoint what side you go to. But I do think what I see in classrooms are things like wiggle seats and elastic bands around the legs of the chairs, and these are all sort of.
What are the elastic bands for? Because I've seen like
so-
kids sitting on the Pilates balls and just
Yep.
kind of like
sitting on
bouncing
the Pilates. They have standing desks. There's the elastic bands they can put their feet on them, and you have to have like the right kind of chair for it, I guess. But when they push the elastic band with their feet,
it kind of like stimulates,
stimulates,
or just gives them something to do, like fidget.
It kind of stimulates the muscles in the joints. And same thing with they have little seats, wiggle seats made out of the same material as yoga balls that you sit on, and it stimulates your core muscles and essentially makes your body think that it's moving. And it helps kids be able to kind of, because their muscles are firing, and so when their muscles are firing, they can actually sit and pay attention. So they're definitely coming up with ways to help these kids so that they can. But
okay, have you seen it actually helping?
I have. I definitely think that these strategies are useful and have their place and can help for a lot of kids.
Okay.
Sometimes I wonder if we're putting all these strategies in the classroom to simulate movement, would giving the group a 15-minute break to run around and play outside do the same thing? And would it get the same work accomplished?
Right.
But that plays into, again, policy and how what our expectations as teachers are
Now,
these days.
do you think that with that knowledge of the wiggle seats and everything, I'm just wondering how long it would take for that a trend to redevelop and the pendulum swinging the other way.
And that's kind of what happens in all of these in policy in general, is things swing from side to side.
You don't have your little crystal ball to tell
no,
me
and my
3
magic
years.
wand's not working this week. And, it's a debate, and you're going to find people on both sides of the debate, and there's probably people who disagree with me 100%, and that's okay. But just from what I see in the kids who come in front of me and are talking about just how hard sometimes it is. And, getting back to the anxiety piece, sometimes kids who appear to not be paying attention and be inattentive are inattentive because they're worrying. They're thinking about all the other things that are going to happen or that could happen. So they're not paying attention to math because it doesn't seem important in that moment, because there's all these other things to worry about. And so again, there's another piece of teasing through, is this attention, is this anxiety? And you can kind of throw another thing in the mix, which is trauma. And trauma is kind of it kind of also fits in with that anxiety piece, because kids who have experienced either specific trauma or generalized trauma, which is sort of more complex trauma, chaotic home lives, low socioeconomic status, families who are homeless, this is a type of trauma, and these kids are worried about so many other things that it's how do I focus?
How am I expected to do my math homework if I don't know if I'm going to have heat
or a house
or
where's mom, or so I guess all of these factors come into play and really make an impact on how each individual kid is going to be able to function and get through a day.
Wow. Okay.
So there is, there's all these different pieces, and I think that's why we're seeing such a rise in the incidence of anxiety, because how do you target all of these things at the same time? And where some of these things didn't exist before, we were able to help kids manage a little bit better. But with all of these things, our kids' pots are so full that, it doesn't seem possible to manage all of these different things.
So what are like the what is the first step that a parent should do if that parent recognizes anxiety or the potential for anxiety in their child? Where do you start?
I start with talk about emotions, identify emotions, make sure your kids can identify different emotions and go beyond just happy and sad and angry. Talk about worried, talk about frustrated and upset and the differences between those and sad and mad, and have an emotional language in your house. Kids who have the language can better articulate what's going on, but if they don't have the language, then they don't know, and then they feel bad because they feel like they're wrong.
And also try to encourage the kids to talk about how they're feeling.
So if you have an emotional language in your house and you're having that conversation with your kids, you're encouraging your kids. And sometimes, especially if you're just starting out with this, your kids are kind of like, yeah, I'm not going to talk to you about this right now. This is weird. Because they're not used to it.
Yeah, and plus you also get the kids that, what'd you do at school today? Nothing.
Yeah. How was your day? Fine. But, that doesn't mean that we as adults can't have that conversation. Okay. School was fine. So how did you feel? Did you feel happy today? Did anything make you feel sad? Did anything make you feel angry? And there are going to be kids who, like I said, initially say nothing, but you're giving them the language so that when something does come up, they can kind of access, because you can't access what you don't know.
Right.
So by giving them the language,
you're opening that line of a communication so they know, like we talked about earlier, the safe place.
Yes.
Home is a safe place. I am a person that you can talk to. No judgments.
And I can access these words and this language because I've heard it before. Okay. So I think that language base is very important. The other thing is when you notice that your child does seem to be anxious or nervous about things a lot, starting to help them identify what their body feels like, because anxiety is very much tied to physical sensations. Okay. We can kind of sense it coming if we're paying attention. We can feel the racing hearts. Bellies usually either get butterflies or knots, or looking for kids to kind of come up with their own way to describe what's happening. Temperature can change. Some kids get really hot or really cold when they get anxious. Okay. So trying to kind of discover what's happening in your muscles. Are you getting really tense? Do you notice your shoulders are really high right now? Yeah. We tend to carry a lot of anxiety in our neck and our shoulders. So, if you notice your kids kind of running around with their shoulders up, you might want to check in and see what's going on. And helping them to identify what those physical sensations might be. And that way, if my tummy feels funny, okay, so why does it feel like you're feeling nervous or worried about something? Yes, okay, so then next step is we connect that with a strategy to calm down and feel better.
What?
So
you probably hear the alarm going
Yep,
off.
I do.
We're out of time. So we'll just have to have a sequel.
Yes, absolutely.
Thank you very much for coming. I really appreciated our conversation, and I don't feel like such a parenting fail myself. And I also want to thank everyone at home for tuning in this evening. I hope you found our conversation as enlightening and as helpful as I did. And I'll see you around town. Good night.